What I am about to tell you is going to be dismissed by every institutional voice that you normally turn to for information about this conflict. And I want you to sit with that dismissal and ask yourself why it comes so quickly, so reflexively, from sources that have been consistently wrong about Iranian military capability at every significant juncture in this conflict. 20 Israeli pilots killed in a single sortie. Not wounded, not missing, not unaccounted for. Killed, and the weapon that killed them was the Dezful ballistic missile, a system that the mainstream analytical community had cataloged as a tactical battlefield weapon insufficient to threaten hardened airbase infrastructure at the range demonstrated in this strike. They were wrong about the range. They were wrong about the warhead performance. And 20 men who flew combat aircraft for the Israeli Air Force are dead because the operational planning that sent them into the air did not accurately account for the threat that killed them. I have been in military environments where post-incident analysis confronts the gap between pre-incident assessment and operational reality. I have watched how institutions process those gaps. The first instinct is always to minimize the gap, to find the framing that makes the intelligence failure look like a close call rather than a systematic failure. That instinct serves institutional interests, and it does not serve the truth. I am going to serve the truth. Let me start with the Dezful missile itself, because you cannot understand what happened without understanding what this weapon actually is, as opposed to what it was assessed to be. The Dezful is an evolution of the Fateh 110 family of solid-fuel ballistic missiles that Iran has been developing and refining for over 2 decades. The Fateh 110 baseline system, first publicly revealed in 2002 and operationally tested extensively in the subsequent decade, established the foundation: a road-mobile, solid-fueled, short-range ballistic missile with a range of approximately 300 kilometers and a circular error probable assessed by Western intelligence at roughly 10 meters in optimal conditions. The Dezful variant, first publicly displayed in 2019 and identified at that time with a range extension to approximately 1,000 kilometers, represented a significant development step. But the operational range demonstrated in this strike exceeds the 2019 public specification by a margin that indicates either the 2019 figure was deliberately understated for strategic ambiguity purposes, which is consistent with Iranian practice regarding sensitive capability disclosures, or the system has been further developed since 2019 in ways that collection did not track with sufficient fidelity. Stay with me, because the warhead performance is where the operational consequence of the range question becomes concrete. The Dezful strike that killed 20 Israeli pilots did not hit the airbase runway or the taxiways or the fuel storage infrastructure. It hit the hardened aircraft shelters at the time of maximum pilot presence, the period immediately following the return of a multi-aircraft sortie when pilots are exiting aircraft, completing post-flight procedures, and beginning the debrief cycle in facilities adjacent to the flight line. The timing was not random. The targeting was not random. The selection of the moment when pilots would be physically concentrated in a defined geographic area adjacent to the identified shelters reflects intelligence collection about Israeli Air Force operational rhythms that is detailed enough to be operationally useful at the tactical level. Iran has been watching Israeli Air Force operational patterns. They have been collecting data about sortie cycles, about the timeline from landing to pilot dispersal, about the locations of pilot debrief facilities relative to hardened shelter positions. The strike that killed 20 pilots was enabled by human and technical intelligence collection that had been building for an extended period. The warhead itself appears to have used a thermobaric or enhanced blast configuration, a warhead type that maximizes overpressure and thermal effects in the interior spaces of structures, rather than relying on fragmentation effects optimized for personnel in open terrain. Against personnel in a semi-enclosed structure like a hardened shelter access area or an adjacent debrief building, a thermobaric warhead produces casualty effects far exceeding what a conventional high-explosive fragmentation warhead of the same weight would produce in the same geometry. The casualty count of 20 confirmed killed at a single point of impact is consistent with thermobaric warhead effects against a concentration of personnel in a semi-enclosed space. It is not consistent with conventional HE fragmentation effects. What the mainstream media will not tell you is that Iran's operational use of thermobaric warheads on ballistic missile platforms represents a capability development that Western assessments had categorized as experimental rather than operational. The shift from experimental to operational deployment with this degree of precision, in terms of timing, target geometry, and warhead selection, means the experimental phase is over. The Iranians have resolved whatever developmental issues prevented earlier operational deployment. The weapon works. They have used it. The calculation that drives further use of this weapon will be entirely about strategic cost benefit, not about technical uncertainty. Here is what actually happened behind closed doors in the Israeli Air Force in the immediate aftermath of this strike. The operational response to losing 20 pilots to a single precision ballistic missile strike is not a planning challenge that Air Force commands exercise routinely, because nothing in modern air war history since the Gulf War has produced this category of single-strike pilot loss from a ballistic missile. The IAF has procedures for casualty management, for combat search and rescue, for maintaining operational tempo after losing aircraft. It does not have the same procedural depth for managing the operational consequences of losing 20 of its most highly trained human assets simultaneously. The training pipeline for Israeli combat pilots is approximately 3 years from selection to squadron assignment. 20 pilots represent 60 years of combined pipeline investment. You cannot replace that on any timeline that is operationally relevant to the current conflict. The secondary consequence involves morale and operational psychology in the surviving pilot community. Every pilot currently flying combat missions knows what happened. They know the strike was timed to the sortie cycle. They know that the vulnerability that killed 20 of their colleagues is not unique to the airbase that was struck. The psychological impact of understanding that you are operating in an environment where the adversary has demonstrated the will and the capability to time a precision ballistic missile strike to your landing pattern is not something that training or professionalism eliminates. It is something that commanders will have to manage carefully to prevent it from degrading the operational effectiveness of their remaining combat aircraft capacity. Keep watching, because the strategic consequences of this specific event reach far beyond the IAF's operational situation. 20 Israeli pilots killed by a single Iranian precision ballistic missile strike is a strategic communication that every air force in the world is reading right now. The strategic message is not subtle. Solid fuel ballistic missiles with sufficient range to threaten airbase infrastructure at distances previously considered safe, combined with intelligence collection granular enough to optimize strike timing against maximum pilot concentration, can produce mass casualty pilot losses that degrade air power capacity faster than the aircraft replacement pipeline can maintain operational strength. This is a challenge to the foundational assumptions of air power-centric military doctrine that has dominated Western military thinking since the Gulf War. Those assumptions rest on the survivability of air assets and their crews during the ground phases of conflict. The Dezful strike has struck at crew survivability in a way that the loss of aircraft alone does not. The American response to this development is being formulated right now against a background of extreme strategic complexity. The United States has commitments to Israeli security. It has an existing forward military presence in the theater. It has carrier strike groups that are themselves subject to the precision ballistic missile threat that just killed 20 Israeli pilots. And it has a domestic political environment in which the administration must manage the optics of any response against the reality that the military options available involve escalation risks that its own commanders are flagging as potentially uncontrollable. Before we go any further, I need you to understand what the next phase of escalation will look like if current decisions result in a kinetic American response. An American kinetic response targeting Iranian ballistic missile launch infrastructure and production facilities would require penetrating an integrated air defense system that has been hardened and layered over decades specifically to complicate American strike packages. The IRGC Air Defense Forces operate a network that combines S-300 systems acquired from Russia, domestically produced Bavar 373 systems with comparable performance specifications, and lower-tier systems including ROD and Talash that provide medium-altitude coverage where Western strike aircraft typically operate. Penetrating this network with acceptable attrition rates requires fifth-generation stealth aircraft, and the F-35 fleet available in theater is finite. The strike planning that would be required is not simple, and the window between Iran's knowledge that a strike is coming and its ability to disperse mobile launch assets is narrow. I have been wrong before, and I will be wrong again. My analysis may prove incomplete as events develop, but what I can tell you with confidence is that the Dezful strike that killed 20 Israeli pilots has changed the strategic environment in ways that no amount of careful messaging will undo. The capability has been demonstrated. The intelligence collection infrastructure that enabled the targeting has been revealed. The willingness to use thermobaric warheads on a precision platform against personnel targets has been established. Every subsequent day of this conflict unfolds in a strategic environment shaped by those facts, and the decisions being made right now in Tel Aviv, in Washington, and Tehran will determine whether those facts become the prologue to a broader war or the high water mark of Iranian escalation before a new diplomatic equilibrium is established. The window for the latter is closing with every hour that passes without a strategic decision from the parties capable of closing it.